Then you've got economic activity that exists in the informal sector, that's outside the economy, which is volunteer work and non-paid household work. So a lot of people are critical of the GPI and say, oh, you just load it with negative items. Well, in fact, these two, particularly non-paid household work, is enormous, and GDP leaves that out, and it's a plus item. And this is very interesting, this one here, because I haven't done much research yet, but I think that one of the reasons why GDP has been rising over the last 20 or 30 years is not necessarily because we're producing more goods and services. We are, but there's been a transition or a movement of economic activity away from the informal sector into the formal sector. So, in a sense, there's no more economic activity, it just gets picked up because it's now occurring within the marketplace. And I might get onto that in terms of policy stuff later on. Then there's this is private consumption expenditure. Some public expenditure, which might be classed as consumption, is also beneficial. A lot of it's very defensive or rehabilitative. That's not included. So it's only the stuff that's considered beneficial is included. There's some social costs, I guess you might call it, cost of noise pollution, commuting, crime, unemployment and underemployment. Cost of lost leisure time if we're working too hard, which is not picked up by GDP. Cost of household pollution abatement. So that's a part of the private consumption expenditure, which is actually defensive expenditure. Cost of vehicle accidents. Again, that's a rehabilitative form of expenditure. Cost of family breakdown. Net capital investment. Now, this is a controversial one. I won't talk. It's not a big item, believe it or not. I actually don't include that in my calculation anymore, and it's all to do with the theoretical foundation of the GPI. I won't go into that. There's the net foreign lending borrowing aspect, because that also affects our ability to sustain our well-being. Who owns the natural capital and the human-made capital that we use to sustain our well-being matters. So if we increase our foreign borrowing, it means more foreigners own Australian located capital, natural capital and human-made capital, reduces our ability to manage our capital to sustain our well-being in the future, so that's taken into account. Then you've got all your environmental costs. Loss of farmland, resource depletion, cost of ozone depletion, cost of air pollution, water pollution. Long-term environmental damage includes energy use and also CO2 emissions, loss of wetlands, loss of old-growth forests. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of people right now saying, how the hell do you calculate these costs? You know, you've got to put a dollar value on, and let me tell you, it's not easy. A bit of guesswork involved in a lot of cases. The physical aspects, well, in fact, that's not easy to draw upon either, because as much, and it probably says something, and it's no criticism of the Australian Bureau of Statistics, but economic data, brilliant. Environmental data, shocking. It's improving, and that probably says something about how we think about the economy relative to the environment. So you sum all your positive and your negative items, you get your GPI. I actually isolate these loss of farmland down in my, what I call a cost account, and the rest go in the benefit account, even though some of these are costs. Some of the social that we net against some of the economic benefits. Anyway, this is the per capita GPI of Australia. From 1967 to 2006. This dark line here is per capita GDP, and here is the per capita GPI, which basically peaked in the mid-70s, suggesting, because it's been going down, a bit of a recovery, but sort of going nowhere, that we essentially surpassed the optimal scale, that S star, back in the 70s, suggesting that we should have moved to a steady state economy around the mid-70s. That's not to say that we'd be better off with having the economy as it was in the 70s, but we'd be better off if we had the economy the same size as it was, with basically the same population we had in the mid-70s. That growth of the economy since, yes, it's provided all these economic benefits, but some of these social, environmental costs are growing at a much faster rate and lowering the GPI, not just on an aggregate level, but per capita level. So that's, I guess, much of what I've just said there. One other point there is, not only should we perhaps have moved to, begun the transition to a steady state economy in the mid-70s, what we should have focused on is trying to shift those curves out Rather than move along the curves with growth, shift them out. Stay around about S star and widen the gap between the two curves, which means we don't have to grow the economy and increase our well-being. There's no need to grow the economy to increase our well-being. So movement to a steady state economy is not some sort of static outcome. This is what I've got for South Australia. Unfortunately, I haven't got around, I've got a table for it, but I haven't put it in figure form for South Australia versus rest of Australia. I've done this for Victoria, I'm doing it now for South Australia. What I do is I work out the GPI for South Australia, I work it out for Australia, and then I subtract the South Australian numbers from Australia and get this place in inverted commas called rest of Australia to compare South Australia with rest of Australia. You might be happy to know that South Australia is doing better than this place called rest of Australia. But now, I've got to say also that this GPI is calculated with slightly different items and slightly different type of data than the GPI I've got here for Australia. And the reason being is that I was saying how data is not always good, particularly at the environmental level. At the national level, it's even worse at the state level. In order for me to do a state rest of Australia comparison, I've got to use the same sort of data. So whereas I can use sort of first best data for just doing it for Australia, when I do Australia versus South Australia, I've got to use second and third best data, and sometimes that means leaving out a couple of items. So you can't really compare that one, this South Australian GPI, to the Australian GPI that I've just shown. But as you can see, the blue line is per capita GSP. Okay, we had a bit of a recession here, so-called recession in the early 1990s, but essentially per capita GSP has been rising quite steeply ever since. Per capita GPI for South Australia is sort of flatlined in recent years. Now, the other interesting thing is that as much as South Australia's per capita GPI is higher, so if I had another red line for the rest of Australia, it would be somewhere down here. South Australia's per capita GSP is in fact lower. So we've got a lower GSP but a higher per capita GPI. So it just goes to show you don't have to. So all those people who talk about all the gloom and doom about South Australia, our GSP is not high enough, well, it appears as though our GPI is higher. And a lot to do with that is our smaller population. So it'd be nice to have the Premier here to talk about that, who's thinking about South Australia's population rising to 2 million people by the year 2020, is it? 30, is it? Okay, now I've got some other GPIs, GDP comparisons here for some other industrialised countries. USA, Germany, I know that's a bit small, UK, Austria, Netherlands, Sweden, just to point out that similar sort of a pattern seems to be occurring with these other countries. GPI tends to go up with GDP, and then at some point the GPI falls. Now, these were done about the mid-1990s, these particular GPIs, and this particular paper brought them all together, and the person who wrote the paper suggested that perhaps there's this threshold level of GDP. You get to this level of GDP where the economy grows to a certain size, and if you grow up beyond that, the GPI starts falling. And it appeared as though this threshold level of GDP was somewhere around about $15,000 to $20,000 or international dollars. Now, just clarify what international dollars are. It's a fictitious dollar, but it's based on converting all currencies to a common currency with the same sort of purchasing power parity. Right? So if we did have this thing, with just one currency for the world, it's called international dollars. Basically, what we find is that when these industrialised countries get to about 15 to 20,000 per capita international dollars GDP, the GPI and they grow the economy. Beyond that, the GPI starts to fall.
It seems to be constant in many cases. It seems to have plateaued out.
It does, yeah. Well, okay. In some cases, UK, it's fallen. It is difficult to make comparisons between the different GPIs because, and this is one of the criticisms of the GPI. GPI is still being refined. It's a fairly recent indicator, and that is because every study you find, people use slightly different items. So those 20 items, there'd be one item that's unique to a particular country, but not to another. Also, data has an impact on what items are included, and also affects the valuation technique you use to calculate a particular item. But it's a similar sort of pattern, all the same.